Welcome to week one of No Plastics for Lent, which is an initiative led by young adults across our church and is a time that will call us into prayer for creation, to lament to the ways we have been complicit in the degradation of our earth, and move us towards action to care for our neighbor in fasting from the things that are hurting our planet. This year's discussion will be focused on how advocacy can be a tool for creation care and eco-justice. So, to kick us off with our discussion today, we have Reverend Amy Reumann, ELCA Senior Director for Witness in Society, which is the ELCA Washington, D.C. based team who stewards the advocacy engagement of our church. We have Erin Brown, a Hunger Advocacy Fellow with the ELCA's Lutheran Office for World Community, or LOCI is how it's sometimes referred to, at the United Nations headquarters in New York City, and myself, Kayla Zopfi, the Young Adult Network Coordinator on the Young Adult Communities team at Churchwide, and I also formerly served as a Hunger Advocacy Fellow in the Washington, D.C. based advocacy office of the ELCA last year. Today, this conversation will be focused on civic life and faith, how our faith guides us to advocate, and hopefully we'll also set some good theological grounding for the next couple of weeks of No Plastics for Lent. So with that, I will pass it to Amy to kick us off by talking a little bit about what calls us as Lutherans to advocacy, why this work is important, etc. So, Amy.
Thank you, Kayla, and hi, Erin. It's great to be here and to kick things off on this really important focus that I think has really become a faith practice for many, and extending not just from Lent. You know, we start things in Lent that are good for us or for our community, also that they can become something that are just part of our lives. So, what calls us to advocacy? I'll change the question, who calls us to advocacy, because the answer is always God when we're talking about call. The call comes from God first and foremost, and that happens in different ways in our lives. The first is the recognition that in our baptism, in that identity, God calls us to be in relationship with God and others. And, while I think people very often connect advocacy to the part of the baptismal covenant to strive for justice and peace in all the earth, the truth is advocacy is woven through many of our understanding of baptism, that it's what it means to be a disciple. It's what it means to be to gather for word and sacrament and then to be sent out into the world. What it means to serve, that we serve in a lot of different ways. And one is with our voices or our fingers or however we type or call or send messages. So I think God calls us to advocacy. And sometimes God does that within our own lives as we notice, as we become aware, as we are in relationship. When it talks about Jesus having compassion for others, it uses the word his gut was twisted. It's this great Greek word. That means he felt it in his inside. Sometimes we get angry. Sometimes we get frustrated. Sometimes we get sad when we see what's happening in the world around us, either locally or globally. And sometimes it's that's God calling us to do something. And whether it's prayer or giving money or being in a march or contacting our elected decision makers, all those things are part of that call. I can keep going.
Let's pass it to Erin, and then we'll come back for a discussion later. Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, Amy, thank you for grounding us. And thank you, Kayla, for being the wonderful facilitator for this conversation. Yeah, Amy, I really liked what you said about the feelings of being angry or sad or frustrated, and how the Spirit, how God moves in us, and that is a call to do something about it in the world. And I think that one of the things that drew me to this work in advocacy originally was because of relationships, because of people and stories. And the emotions that I felt witnessing the experiences of loved ones or hearing their stories who've been negatively affected by policies or prejudices that continue to push them to the margins. And many of these stories point to larger systemic issues that are present in our world. And I think that the thing with advocacy was that I didn't want to just shrug my shoulders and say, well, that's just the way that it is. But not wanting exclusion or discrimination to be the end of the story. But the emotions that we feel can push us forward, and that I want to be one of the people that uses my voice for active change, because behind the big policy issues, behind these big topics that society engages with today, there are individual people who are affected by the outcomes of the decisions that are made. And I think that that is the space that God is calling us to abide and work in.
Yeah, I similarly have been reflecting on ways that or like what has drawn me to advocacy. And I think a lot about how I have been doing advocacy since I was a child without knowing it. I often tell the story about how in elementary school, I had a friend who was being bullied by a group of boys. And so I organized friends from several different classes that all had recess at the same time. Um, to basically intervene if they saw this group of boys coming up to her at recess. I wouldn't know until a little over a decade later that that actually has a name, and it is called coalition building. But the reason I was so outraged for my friend was because I was taught that we are all created in the image of God and we are supposed to love each other like Jesus loves us. And so when that wasn't happening, I was empowered to do something about it. And now, you know, several years later, several years after I learned what coalition building means, I am now a seminarian at Wartburg Theological Seminary, shout out Wartburg, and I'm in the candidacy process to become a deacon. Also, shout out deacons. Erin is about to be consecrated as a deacon in a couple of months through the Lutheran Diaconal Association, so yay, deacons. And hopefully I'll continue to do this faith-rooted advocacy and organizing in some capacity for the rest of my life through this vocational call. But even now, I continue to carry that message that is so simple that an elementary schooler can not only understand it, but can employ it, that we are all created in the image of God and that we are supposed to love each other like Jesus loves us. But the reality in our country and our whole world, frankly, is that institutions have been built to too often honor power and profit over community thriving, which I believe is antithetical to how God invites us into living our lives with the tools and gifts that we have been given and the ways that we are created for each other. And I think many young people in this church have similar stories like Erin and I that have led us to being civically engaged, whether that is showing up in policymaking spaces, whether that is showing up to vote, doing service work, signing petitions, any type of collective action that's oriented towards moving our communities in a different direction. I think we as people of faith are called into that responsibility of using our voices and helping empower other people to use their voices to tell their stories, also like Erin talked about. And so I want to end with, there's a really great line in the resource Advocacy 101 for Young Adults When Faith Meets Public Policy that talks about government as a gift. And this is something that's been really grounding for me. And I share this all the time with peers. I just was a part of organizing a letter writing campaign at Wartburg on Farm Bill advocacy. And I used this as we were framing it for our peers. So I'm just going to read the quote. It says, God gives us government as a way of securing peace and freedom in the world. When structured by justice and operating with fairness, government helps each of us and our neighbors live safe, healthy, full lives in community. Because of human nature, the world cannot be perfect, but it can be just. God calls us to take seriously the world as it is. We can be realistic about how far we are from God's vision, but we also have real possibilities for peace and equity. So yeah, and I continue to be more and more energized for civic engagement the more I learn about how our denomination's commitment for civic engagement is utilized, and as it evolves over time. And as I see congregations in my synod and even my synod itself showing up alongside young adults who often find ourselves in spaces of civic engagement anyway. But yeah, it is that love for civic engagement and love for faith, and specifically the intersection of those two, that are the reason I became a Lutheran in college-ish. So I think there are some threads that I'm hearing in this civic engagement. And so I want to pop back to Erin. You talked about like stories of advocacy, and how those move us, whether they are our own experiences or stories of people that we love. I would love to hear from you, if you could tell us a story about like a time that you saw advocacy in motion through a faith lens that was really powerful.
That's a really good
And
question.
or Amy.
Hmm. I think one of the big stories that immediately comes to my mind is the work that my congregation that I'm a part of in New York City does. St. Peter's Church is a ELCA church in Midtown Manhattan, and they have just a really unique story. But in 2019, they had these two merged communities form a new St. Peter's Church. But one of the really big things that they do at St. Peter's every Sunday is this Compass program for folks who've recently arrived to the city. And that program has really taken off since last summer, when a lot of people who many migrating from Latin America or arriving in the city and just did not have any idea of how to navigate in this giant city. And so the program is something that allows people to come in, speak with a legal representative about their case. They're able to kind of ask a lot of questions about a lot of different pieces that are part of their journey within the legal system, but just also within the city and trying to navigate it. And part of that is also within our congregation is an accompaniment program that we members of the church will also accompany individuals to their court date. So people will attend, walk with them to Federal Plaza, enter in, sit in the courtroom, and then also participate in Jericho walks, where congregant members will walk around the Federal Plaza building 7 times. And that happens monthly. But this idea of walking with our neighbor, and also being prophetic voices in policies that continue to discriminate or exclude or are confusing for a reason, to keep people in situations of difficulty. So I think that just the work and the call to walk with and listen to our neighbor is something that I see constantly happening at St. Peter's.
I love that. Amy, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to also share a story of when you have seen faith-rooted advocacy as a powerful change maker.
Yeah, I was just reminded of this story a couple days ago by a colleague from when I was in the Pennsylvania state office, and it started when a congregation, rural, small town congregation discovered there was a car in their parking lot, and there was a young mother and her child living in it. And they did the right things. They rallied around her, got to know her, worked to find a place for her to live, connect her with services. And they learned through this just how hard it was to that she could either access, that the right kind of help was there, and was she able to access it. And so they were spending, a lot of time and energy and love in supporting one woman and one child. And which led them to finally to their state public policy office, because they were realizing some of the forces around access to affordable housing and help for her finding a job, and the answers were locked into policy that needed to be changed. And so she began to come, bringing along members of that community who accompanied her to tell her story, both in the state legislature with lawmakers, as well as in other public forum with groups that were organizing around housing reforms. And it became very powerful, because then members of the congregation started doing it themselves as well. And so it was really a culture shift and a self-understanding shift that as church, yes, we're responding to the immediate needs of one person, and then seeing that there's so much more that's affecting not just her, but many, many others, and that the way to address that is together through policy. And I think it made that congregation, it enlivened their life, because, it's not just about me and God in our faith relationship, but that, God points us out. And sometimes in strange and sometimes slightly scary ways, but they really stepped up and learned through that, and I think became a different kind of community.
Amy, I'm wondering, you talked a little bit how like feelings can help us identify when we feel God calling us to do something. I am wondering if you can say more about how you have kind of like honed that process of discernment, especially in a way that like honors and listens to our emotions, but still moves us to action. I fear that Amy is frozen. Is she frozen for you, Erin?
I think she is.
Okay. We're gonna go with it. And Erin, I'm actually gonna ask you as a pivot point, how have you as a young adult, similarly along these lines, have you navigated like building your tolerance and endurance for advocacy when often it is very personal? You talked about stories and like you come to care so deeply with the people you advocate with. So like how do you like sustain yourself in your advocacy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that for me, kind of formally doing advocacy work was a big transition initially, that I was really hoping to see kind of the results of things happening right away. And I think at the beginning of my time as a hunger advocacy fellow, it was really hard for me to kind of attend meetings at the UN or get to meet some representatives, but then not really see the fruits of what was being talked about kind of come to fruition. And I think one of the things that Christine Mangale, the director of the Lutheran Office for World Community and the main representative for the Lutheran World Federation at the UN said pretty initially was like, yeah, it's hard. Advocacy work is hard, because if you want to start seeing change, you have to start working on something now to see any kind of change happen 10 years from now. And so I think that one of the things that I've been thinking about as I've been reflecting on the word she said were from a Bishop Utner in a prayer that he had in his homily, which is now commonly known as the Romero prayer. But one of the pieces in that says that we're prophets of a future not our own, that we might not see what the fruits of our labor in this lifetime, but that doesn't mean that we don't, that doesn't mean that we get to just stop doing the work that needs to be done. And that I think to advocate is to give witness, and that means pointing to the truth. And the truth is that in our world, our society continues to create systems that exclude, endanger, and harm. So advocating calls for us to be brave, and that means being a prophetic voice and pointing to the truth. I think that pointing that Amy touched on earlier, that Jesus did not shy away from speaking to the concrete material conditions of our society, and we as prophetic voices giving witness must not shy away from speaking to the context and reality of the truth that's present in our reality, but also lifting our voices with hopefulness, that another world is possible and that we can see this change in the future. It might not be the future that we get to see in this lifetime, but it's still something that we work towards.
Thanks for that. We are about at time, so I'm really grateful that we got to end on a really hopeful note and a prophetic note, Erin. I'll say thanks for being with us, Erin and Amy. It looks like she is maybe frozen again. A trooper for circling back, but such is technology and we work with it. Thanks to everybody who is watching this and who is joining this No Plastics for Lent campaign. Our world changes only when we ask it to. So grateful to be in this space, grateful to be young adults together. And with that, we will say farewell for this panel. Bye.
Bye.